Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. It is so nice to have all of my listeners back this week. Thanks, you guys, for always tuning in and listening to just another one of our courageous guests who are willing to come here and share their story with you. I am so excited about this week's guest, and you'll know why as we get into our conversation. Of course, I always really deeply appreciate being able to interview people who have lost a sibling, because of course you all know that is also what brought me on this journey and why I have this podcast. So today I want to introduce to you Janice Jernigan. And Janice's life's work is centered around deepening connections within, with nature, and with each other. This shows up in her roles as a vineyard and winery owner, inner trailblazer, and a best-selling author of her book, Opening Up to Grief, which you can see the beautiful cover is behind her. She and her husband are the founders and cultivators of Serenberry Vineyards in the beautiful mountains near Blue Ridge, Georgia. They are also owners and caretakers of the Vineyard House, an early 1900s farmhouse where guests linger for an extended weekend while connecting with nature's simple pleasures. And we are going to be talking a lot about Janice's story in her beautiful memoir. So without further ado, welcome to Leap. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you. And the more episodes I listen to, the more I've read your book, the more I'm like, I cannot wait to talk to you and to share our stories with your listeners.
Well, I'm thrilled that you're here for so many different reasons. And I think you are the first guest that we have had on the show that lost a sibling as a young child. And I think sibling loss, I think, is overlooked all the time for various reasons. But I think especially when a child is very young, we jump to a whole bunch of assumptions that we're children, you're going to get over it, you're going to forget, you're going to do all the things. But we know that our cells hold memory. And, when I was running bereavement groups, we started grief groups as young as 3, because the idea is if you're young enough, if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to grieve. Or if you're young enough to love, you're young enough to grieve. So I feel like your story is so important for those who perhaps have a lot of unresolved, stuck grief if they lost a sibling as a child, but also for parents to hear your story and to know that if they have lost a child and they have young children, just the profound impact it can have. So I'd like you to start from the beginning, if you would not mind. Your book really, I said this earlier before we started recording, your memoir is so gorgeously written and really does show the story of you with your unresolved grief, your spiraling, and then what happened when you were able to actually get into grief work. Take us there. Take us to when, that 3-year-old, when you lost your sister.
Yes. So my sister, Julie, she died from leukemia, and she was 7 years old. At the time, it was a death sentence. 95% of children in the mid-70s, if they were diagnosed with leukemia, they didn't have much of a chance of survival. Luckily, that has changed tremendously now. But I was 3 years old, and she and I, we spent all the time we could together. We slept in the same bed. I had this scrunchy face, as it became known, that would make her laugh. And I was her shadow. We spent as much time as we could together. An older sister, a younger sister, that at 7 and 3 and the ages leading up to that, we were just very loving with each other. I was her baby, and she was who I wanted to be when I got older. And when she died, she had been sick for about 18 months. And when she died, that as a 3-year-old, you don't really understand what death means. You probably haven't had exposure to that. And certainly you don't realize that it's final, that it means that person is not coming back. And so that was something that I don't have any memories of my sister. And that's a loss in itself for me. I
And
depend on other people to share their memories with me, and it's through their filter.
well, I lost my father when I was 10 months old, and so I was, much younger, but it's interesting because it's the same, right? Like I didn't know my dad, but I was just a baby, but I would see videos of him and I know that, you had photographs of you and your sister. Talk to us about your younger years as you grew older, where you actually can remember some of the memories you have. Did your parents talk about Julie, or did they stop talking about her?
They talked about Julie some. I always knew I had a sister, and we would go to the cemetery where she was buried. My parents would tell me about Julie, just snippets about Julie. I think they were really at that place of trying to balance, moving forward and yet still sharing about Julie with me. And so there wasn't a lot of talk about Julie. And in our home, we didn't have any family pictures hanging on the wall. And back then, it was very common for families to have a whole family wall of pictures. I didn't know this, until I started going to my friends' houses, but they didn't have pictures of our family. And later on, when I asked about that, it was really, my mom said, it was very hard to think about having a picture of Julie around the house. And yet it was also hard to think about having a picture of the 3 remaining family members, my parents and me, because it was as if we were not acknowledging that I had a sister.
Mhm.
So, back then, this was in the mid-70s when my sister died, and people didn't really talk about grief near as much as they do today. And so it was one of those things that was known, this loss was known, and yet it really wasn't talked about much at all. And I don't recall any of my other family members talking about Julie.
And yet, and I have mentioned this on this podcast before, but for listeners who may not have heard that episode, there is this wonderful podcast. It's not actually running anymore. It's called Dear Sugars, and they did a series with Cheryl Strayed and Steve Almond, and they did a series on called The Empty Chair. And what they talk about is even when you're young like this and your sister's gone, it's still a ghost in the air, right? There's this ghost of this child that was your sister, and it was just the 2 of you. So it's not like that you have a bunch of siblings running around, right? It's the one who's alive and the one who is dead. I mean, not to be, but it's the truth, right? I mean, that it's just the truth. And then and I can imagine, and I read this in your memoir, right? You become like the one who is gone is the perfect one. And of course they are perfect because they were 7. They were like they were 7 when they passed, but for you, you're holding the weight of being both to your parents, right? The sister who has died and you. And I know that through reading your story, you had no idea that this unresolved grief was impacting who you were, how you felt, the struggles that you felt during, your formative years in high school and depression. I know at one point you had felt suicidal. Take us there. I would love for you,
Yes.
Janice, to sort of bring us on that journey of, those adolescent years where you literally did not know what was happening to you, but this unresolved grief was impacting you so profoundly. Yeah.
Right, right. Yes, I thought something was wrong with me. And so my sister, as I mentioned, my sister died when I was 3. And a couple of years later, I met a neighbor who became a best friend. And we were best friends from the time we were about 5 all the way up till, partway through high school. And she became like a sister to me. I didn't have conscious memories of my sister, but this friend represented what I thought I would have had with my sister. And we ended up, as people often do in high school with friends, you grow apart. And so we did. There was actually she wrote me a letter, and, that was really kind of our breakup letter, if you will. And I was just distraught at that because it felt like I was losing a sister all over again. I didn't realize it was the second time in that moment, but I knew it really hurt deep. And then later I, was around the 15-year-old age and started dating. I had a boyfriend and we dated off and on for a couple of years. And he became my everything, my best friend. And as often happens, your first love is not usually your last love, so that's a common thing that happens in high school is you love and you break up. And when that happened to me, I felt like my life was ending. I really did not know. I could not fathom how I could go on without this now another loss in my life. And so that's really what led me to halfway through my junior year of high school. It was the first day of the second semester, and my recent ex-boyfriend was in my class. And I knew I can't do this. I had no strength. I didn't feel like to be able to face him and to go on. And so I ended up dropping out of high school when I was a junior. And my parents, I can only imagine how they were feeling now as an adult. I think about my parents, but at the time, they just wanted to do whatever they could to help me. And so
And you had contemplated taking your life during this time too,
I
correct?
had, yes. Yeah. At one point during the time that I had my first boyfriend, during one of our on again, off again times, it was a time when we had broken up and he was dating someone else. And I decided I liked him again and wanted to date. And he didn't share those feelings. And that crushed me. And I did. I remember standing at the kitchen counter with, over the counter pain pills that I thought, well, I'll just take these. And I didn't really want to die. I just didn't want to be in the pain. And as a, 16-year-old, 17-year-old, I didn't know how to get out of the pain. And that's the only thing I could think of, had heard about as a way to get out of the pain. And I was very fortunate that I was on the phone with my ex-boyfriend, and he and his mother, I don't know how they got to my house as quickly as they did, but they came over. They spent the rest of the afternoon with me. They made sure I was not alone.
And where were your parents? Because I remember asking myself this question as I was reading your memoir, and I don't think you ever told us were they working? Were your parents?
They were. They were both at work.
Okay.
And it's amazing that, and I was and am very close with my parents. And when they read my book, they were surprised about that. They did not know I had suicidal thoughts and had gotten to that point. And yet we were close, and yet that was a part of my life they weren't even aware of. And that's no one's fault. It just
why do you
yeah.
suppose I want that this is for the parents. This is more for the parents at this point right now who may be listening in. Why do you suppose, in hindsight now, after you've done so much work, so much personal work, a ton of grief work, you've written your memoir, why do you suppose you kept that from them during that time?
It was something that, well, during that time, I was ashamed of that. I thought, what is wrong with me? And I knew they had already been through so much with losing my sister. And there was this from other people around me, it was this, I was going to say unspoken, but it was spoken that your parents have already been through enough. You just need to get your act together because they don't need to have to go through a lot with you.
Okay,
And
let's
so,
stop here. That's what I was
yes,
hoping. That's okay. So I want to stop here for a moment. Don't lose your train of thought of where you were going. This is, I read, so when I was in the midst of writing my book, I also wanted to understand the experience of a parent losing it because, of course, in our culture, there is the most horrific thing that any parent can ever imagine is losing their child. And then they're so bereft, it is very difficult for them to be there for their surviving children, at least during those early days, early
uh,
months. I could call it years, right? Because a parent will never stop grieving the death of their child. Just as I feel like a sibling, I will never stop missing my brother. I mean, it's
right.
we evolve and our life grows around it, etc. But I talk to my brother every single day, and it'll be 9 years in February. So do you remember, you put a lot of the weight on your own shoulders, right, around who you needed to be for your parents, but do you remember, now looking back, do you feel like your sister's death also impacted your parents' ability to be there for you in any way, physically, emotionally, etc.?
Yes. I don't see how it could not have been the case. I mean, they loved my sister dearly. And it was actually, I was listening to one of your earlier podcast episodes, a more recent one, and the guest was talking about how when their parent died, the things that he brought out of their sibling was gone. And I thought that is so true because what Julie brought out of my parents was gone. What we were like as a family of four was gone. And so, we were all in that place of just trying to make it through the next day. And we didn't really, of course, hindsight, and luckily people do talk about loss and grief much more. I'm very grateful for that. But back then it was, well, that happens and you just need to move on.
So you, like, your mother and your father probably never, I mean, I'm sure they weren't grief groups for them to go to, right? And to try to process
No,
what had happened. They had to like stuff it down and carry on. They had a daughter to raise, they had jobs, etc. So they had their own profound grief that they were trying to deal with while they were trying to raise you.
they they did. And it was also, I guess the thought around them too was, if you believe that Julie is in a good place, why would you be sad? And so there was this pressure to not be sad, to
And where
not
did
show
that come
those
from? Was
emotions.
that from your parents, or was that just a belief that swirled around you? Did you hear this? Did you just take it on? Where did you
That
come to carry that belief?
well, that was a belief that was all around me, whether it was at church and I went to a school that was related to the church. And so it was really just that feeling. And I hear it with people even today of, it's time to move on. It's been a certain period of time, whatever that time period is, it's time to move on. And time heals all wounds. We hear that, which I do not believe that. I believe we learn, and our grief becomes a part of us, but we don't move on. We integrate our grief, or we go through grief. But back then, that was really the thought of, it's almost like if you ignore it, it'll go away. Just stay busy, get involved in something else, and you won't be sad anymore. You won't have all the feelings that you have that are associated with loss and grief.
So let's circle back to that time when your parents were working, you had a bottle of pills, you did reach out to your ex-boyfriend at the time and his mother. So Bravo for that, because that had to have taken a tremendous amount of courage too. And you said something very important, which I believe is the majority of people who take their life don't necessarily want to die, but as you so eloquently put it, they do not want to feel the pain anymore. This pain that feels like it's going to be there forever. So you tell them, they come, right? They come to your aid. Was that a turning point? Talk to us what happened in that moment when you reached out, you chose not to take these pills. You obviously wanted to live. What happened next?
I don't remember the specifics of that. I do know I was very ashamed that I had done that. And that's why it really wasn't until I was writing my book and I was digging deep into my story and that I really revisited that because I'd been so ashamed of it. I hadn't spoken of it. I hadn't really thought about it in a long time. And it really brought it back to the surface when I was writing. And I thought, wow. And for the first time as an adult, looking back on this 16-year-old, I was able to have empathy for that teenager to say, wow, there's no reason to be ashamed, that you were doing the best you could based on what you knew at the time. I also know that I reached out to my ex-boyfriend when at the time we were friends. And when I'm very honest with myself, I saw it as a manipulative thing that I was doing, that I really didn't want to take these pills. I just wanted him to stop me. And
That's a beautiful insight, right?
it's, yeah,
and it worked too, because you two got back together, right?
Well, we did for a while. But so it was a very manipulative thing to do. And it saved my life because he was tuned in to me. And I'm so thankful he came across my path at that time. That too, I had carried that with me into adulthood thinking, wow, I was possessive of my best friend and my boyfriend. And then I was manipulative. And looking back again, as an adult, looking back and having empathy for who I was at that time, I was doing the best I could. I did not have the coping skills. That's something that happens when we lose someone, especially before adulthood. As a child or teenager, we have not developed the coping skills, the healthy coping skills. And so we use whatever we have at our disposal. And so that's what I did.
I would say that is true throughout the lifespan. We always default to what we have. And if we, and sometimes, right, that's our red flag of when is it time to seek help beyond what we have in our own toolbox, right? Which brings me to a moment, one of the most powerful parts about your memoir that I paused, I reread it, was this idea of the pain that started in your body. Because even at this point, right, even in your high school, you drop. So I'm just going to do some summarizing here. You go through a lot during your teenage years. You had the bout with your life. You end up breaking up with your boyfriend. You drop out of school. You finish high school online, I think is the way that you finished. Is that how you got your high school degree?
It was called Open Campus back then. It was actually in person, but it was at a special high school.
Because talk to us about that. Like, so you were struggling in mainstream. What was going on? Were you just like, I can't do this? Was it overstimulating? What was happening? Because to quit school is a pretty big deal, right? I mean, to drop out of high school. What was happening? Because all of these things were going on inside of you, and you just thought that you were messed up, right? As a kid, you're just like, there's something wrong with me. I'm flawed. What ultimately happened where you had to drop out of school? You just could not attend anymore. Tell us what happened.
That was having my ex-boyfriend in one of my classes. I knew I could not go to school every day and see him and have a reminder of what I had lost. And So I dropped out of school. I was working at the time in a retail store, and I was doing that. And then I went to what they called open campus, which was school at night. And with people that had either dropped out or been kicked out of school, that's where people went. They went to open campus. And so I got to be around people that none of us fit in. At open campus, no one really fit in. And so there was kind of that camaraderie, I guess you would say, because we were all people that didn't fit into the norm. And so, as you mentioned, I did go back and finish school. I went back to my high school my senior year. And all this time, I never knew I had unresolved grief.
Right. So we're
That
getting there.
never crossed my mind.
Right. Why would you? Why would you even have any
Yeah,
idea that this is what was actually happening and causing all of these feelings and heartache and really despair, right? I mean, when you get
right.
to a point where you're thinking about taking your life, that's deep despair. So you go back to school, which took a tremendous amount of courage. What does it feel like for you to re-enter your senior year? And then I want you to get into when you started feeling the pain, because that's when life really started to change for you. So what
Yes.
happened your senior year when you went back? Were you scared? Did you have a best friend that helped you to go back? What was that? Why did you make the decision to go back to school? Actually, physically back to the high school?
Right, right. I I had done some healing enough to feel like I could face a situation. If my ex-boyfriend was there, I could face that. And I did end up making friends with some people. And when I went back my senior year, I had actually through open campus, and I went to summer school as well, I had actually gotten ahead in my classes. So I had a very light schedule my senior year. So I went for about half the day to school. And then I was part of, they had a work study program. And so I got to leave school around lunchtime and go work, in a retail store. And so that was great. It really gave me confidence to work in a retail store. I mean, all throughout, even when I had dropped out of school, I was working in a retail store and people saw me differently. I was able to, even as a 16-year-old, I was given leadership responsibilities. I was responsible for someone other than myself. And that, I think it was a combination of all those things really helped me to have the courage and the strength to go back to school and know that, hey, this is what's important to me now.
And did you ever get into, so during these high school years, did you ever get into drinking and drugs and those types of things to sort of numb emotion? How were you handling your emotional life
Yeah.
during this
My,
time?
the biggest go-to for me was shopping. So so as I mentioned, I worked in retail and I would get a huge paycheck when you think about how it was all disposable income. I didn't have to pay for room and board. I was living at home. I was a teenager. And so I had plenty of money. And there happened to be this clothing store a few doors down from where I worked. And I learned how to catch them when they were having a sale so I could get more things. And shopping just really ended up being the way I numbed my pain. A lot of people kind of turn to different things, whether it's drinking or shopping, or it can even be investing so much in helping others. That could be almost an addiction because it's really about something that takes you away from feeling and
Abs-
focusing on you and your pain. And that's what shopping did for me.
Yeah,
So
because I noticed
I had
you,
bags of
I
clothes.
no, I bet you did. I was wondering if your mother ever said anything about your clothing and your closet. And well, you worked in retail too, so also made it very easy for you to have access to continuously shop. Plus, you got a discount.
Exactly. I worked at a shoe store at one point and I could calculate a 30% off discount really quickly. So I had plenty of clothes, plenty of shoes. That was my addiction. And that's something that, not that it was a clinical addiction, but that's something that people don't necessarily recognize as numbing a lot of times. I mean, there's a lot of jokes about retail therapy. Well, that's exactly what I was doing. And I didn't know that's why I was doing it. I just thought I was a great bargain shopper.
Right, exactly. I mean, there are so many different things that we do to numb our pain because feeling it, as you know, is a lot of hard work. And I've said it a million times on this show, and I'll say it again. You can't escape it. It's going to land. It is going to go somewhere in the body. And that's what I would like us to move into now is this physical pain that you started to feel, because that felt at the point where you no longer, with physical pain, you can't run away from it. I mean, you can try to numb it, right? You can get into drugs and drinking and whatnot, but physical pain is a very hard thing to run away from. Typically, people seek out professionals and try to figure out what is going on with the pain in their body because it is with you all of the time. So tell us when that started happening, where it was in your body, and the steps that you took to address it that finally led you to doing the grief work that set you free, really, right?
Yes, for sure. Well, so I went to college, I graduated college. I ended up getting married at a very young age, and I threw myself into my work. And I had a good job, a company I enjoyed working with. And, even though my marriage ended after about 6 years, I that just made me work more. And it was a cycle because I could work more, I could earn more money, I could go shopping more. I mean, all these things, it was just this ongoing cycle. And so, fast forward, and I found my soulmate, my husband, who I've now been married to for 21 years. Still, I was working a lot. And it's that I kept getting rewarded for working a lot. And so I kept working more and more. And over time, I started noticing pain, and it was an all over pain. It wasn't a pain that stayed in a certain place. It was just an all over pain. And it got worse and worse and worse. I tried to ignore it. It didn't work. Or it worked for a time.
Where was it showing up? You said it was all over. Did it feel like an ache? Like what did it feel like?
It was like an achiness all over. Think about like having the flu, except for on steroids. I had a hard time just, I flowed through the world like someone who was 80 years old, and I was in my early 30s. I mean, my husband and I, we had a house at the time, we had a house where our bedroom was on the second floor, and I was needing to literally crawl up the stairs to get to our bedroom. I could not function, and I was very fortunate that I had a boss that would allow me to work from home before it was mainstream, to work as I could, because I was having a hard time doing what was required of a 40-hour work week, a traditional 40-hour work week.
And what were the
So,
doctors saying? Were you seeking, you must have been seeking
yes,
professional help at this point.
I did. I reached out to all kinds of different doctors, and special anywhere from a rheumatologist, neurologist, so many ologists, and then all the way to the other end of the spectrum with natural healing. And I tried so many different medications. I was diagnosed with quite a few different ailments, where the common thread was that there was no, specific thing they could, really put their finger on, and there was no known cure. And
So
so,
were they giving you medication? Were they like,
yes,
okay, they were, that's right. Yes, I read it. Yes. Okay, keep going.
yes, they tried different medications. None of them were really making a difference for me. I still had this horrible, all over, just debilitating pain. And so this went on for a couple of years. And finally, there were a couple of different specialists I went to that both of them separately said, you need to go to a pain management specialist because you're going to have this pain for the rest of your life. And like I said, I was in my early 30s and I thought, oh my goodness, this is not what I had planned for my life. So I knew if I was going to be able to face having this debilitating physical pain the rest of my life, I needed emotional support. And so
Which
that's
which
when,
is so it is so powerful when I was reading that in your book that you didn't even make the connection yet that
oh,
that emotional pain could be manifesting as physical pain in your body. Instead, you're like, well, if I got to live with this, I better go get some help on how to deal with it because that's another physical pain catapults people into deep depression, right?
right,
And also can cause suicide ideation. So
right.
you decide, okay, I can surrender to the pain, but if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to go see a therapist to really help me work through the mental pain around acceptance.
Yes. Yes. And so I went and I call her therapist Mary, but my therapist, Mary, I went to see her my very first session. She asked me, what brings you here? And I said, well, I really don't know because I have a wonderful husband, good family, great job, good house. I mean, I just happen to have this horrible pain and I need help emotionally to deal with that. And so she listened and she asked me, tell me about your parents and any siblings. And so I told her my parents are still married, they love each other. And I told her what I had learned to say to people growing up, which was my sister. I had a sister who died when she was 7. She had leukemia, and I was 3. I grew up as an only child. That's what I learned to say. Because when I had not said that last part about growing up as an only child, people would say to me, wow, that must have been tough on your parents. Or, well, at least you were too young to understand. And so I had collected those beliefs too. So when I said that to Mary, for the first time in my life, the other person said, wow, tell me more about that. What what was it like growing up without your sister? What do you remember about her? What can you tell me about your relationship? No one had ever asked me that. And here I was 33, and no one, it'd been 30 years, and no one had asked me that.
What did
And
it
so,
feel like for you in that moment? Because I know the floodgates opened for you during,
oh,
your therapy with her, and you literally blossomed. And I know that's one of your chapters. What happened? Were you stunned? Were you tongue-tied? Were you in shock? What happened when you were asked a question of what it was like for you to grow up without your sister?
I was shocked. I didn't know. I didn't have a prepared answer for that like I did for all the other things people would say. And so I felt validated and I felt like I was being seen for the first time when it came to the loss of my sister. And I'll never forget at the end of that first session, Mary said to me, she was like, Janice, I cannot promise you anything, but I believe you are suffering from stuck grief. And I remember she suggested that we do some grief work together. And I remember thinking, stuck grief, what is that? I've never heard of that. I mean, that it seems a bit far-fetched. Stuck grief, something that happened 30 years ago could be impacting me today.
And
But
did she make that connection at that early stage of the stuck grief could be the pain in
yes,
your body? Okay, I just wanted to make sure that
yes,
yeah.
she did. And I remember I was so I was at the end of my rope when it came to hope. I was almost out of hope. And she represented hope by saying that, hey, this is something that we can work on. No promises, but we can work on this. And I'll never forget something she said to me, which is no one gets a pass on grief. No one gets a pass on grief.
And I love, yes, that's right. And I loved reading that too. I love that she said that.
Yes, it's so true. And so I'll often say, no one gets a pass on grief, not even a 3-year-old, not even if it's been decades since the loss, not even if no matter what your relationship was with the person, even if you don't have your own memories you can articulate, your heart remembers. So,
I often say
yeah,
we ourselves remember, ourselves hold our memory,
yes.
our grief, all of those different things. How long, I've got two questions because I can't even believe it's the top of the hour already. Okay, so going back to with Mary, so how long did you work with your therapist? How long were you in therapy for?
So let me say that those first 6 weeks that I worked with her, it was as if my sister had just died. The grief was so raw. I cried more tears than I have cried in my life because I had decades of tears and emotions to come out. As far as how long I worked with her, she I am a big believer in therapy, and
Me
she
too.
remained, yes, she remained as my therapist all the way through until she retired, and I ended up being her last client. So I had regular conversations, not as frequently, but I had sessions with Mary for 15 years.
Okay, well, let me ask a different question. When, through the work that you were doing with her, when did you start to feel the pain in your body begin to subside?
So that's a great question. And at that time, I had not really learned to tune in to my body unless it was screaming at me like it had been. And it wasn't until about 6 months after I started to see Mary, we had planned a trip. My husband and my parents and we were going to go on a trip to Disney World, where there's a lot of walking required. And there was a lot of concern about if I would be able to do that. And we had planned the trip way in advance, not knowing if I would be able to go and walk around. So that was 6 months after I first started working with Mary, and my pain was gone by the time that trip came around. I did not have pain. It,
Well, were you in shock? Like,
yeah,
and
I
also,
was.
what is happening with your parents and your husband? Like, are you talking to your parents about this grief work that you're doing? Are you pulling them in to this process that you are going through?
Yeah, so I was shocked that the pain went away, and I have since learned that the pain had served its purpose. So it didn't need to stay. As far as, one thing that Mary would say to me is when one person goes to therapy, their whole family goes to therapy. Whether they're in the room or not, the whole family is going through therapy. And that
Can,
is definitely true
and
with my family.
can you just say why that is? Why is that when she said when one person goes to therapy, the whole family goes to therapy? Why do you think that is?
Well, because we all are in this family dance where we have our roles and how we show up. It's an unspoken or maybe spoken rule of how we show up, the norm for our family. And when one person changes that dance, it changes everyone around them. And I certainly, I'm the kind of person that when I learn something, I want to tell other people about it. And that's how I was with my husband and with my parents. And, my husband had a loss of his mother when he was very young. And then of course, my family, my parents, they certainly had lost a child with my sister. And so being able to talk with them, and my parents, as I mentioned earlier, didn't really talk about Julie a lot. There would be snippets here and there. But what was great is when I was going through therapy, I had a lot of questions for them, and they would always answer my questions. I just needed to know what questions to ask, and they were as open as they could be with me.
So the pandemic happened. you decided to write your book. And of course, like I said, I did my whole dissertation on writing through grief and loss. So I can imagine that writing that memoir was a catalyst for even deeper healing. You now do retreats. You won this award. There are two more things I want to get to. And one is this award that you won because you also were a catalyst at the time when you had a job in corporate America that you actually you helped to change the bereavement days, right? Because in our culture, it's like, oh, you have a loss, go take 3 days off. It's utterly ridiculous. But
Right.
they asked you to be a part of that, correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that because I think it's incredible.
Yes. Well, that project was looking at multiple things, and bereavement was a piece of that. And that was the last big project I was on before I left my corporate job. And it meant so much because typical traditional bereavement policies, to your point, they would say 3 days, or they put a value on people. If it's your mother, you get this many days. If it's your cousin, you might get 1 day.
I
If
don't
it's
think
a
you get
friend,
anything for cousins, do you?
probably not.
But
If
they're
it's your
like
friend,
siblings.
exactly. If it's your friend, that's not listed. Or what if your grandparents raised you? So we really changed that policy to be more about it's about you determine what you need, the time that you need. And people don't take advantage of that. I think a lot of times we think that that's what's going to happen. And people just appreciate being able to focus on what matters, whether it's the logistical things that come from someone passing away if you're responsible for arrangements or legal things, that takes time as well. And so it meant a lot to me to be able to be part of changing the policy for bereavement in our company that had 50,000 people at the time. And so I felt like I was making an impact on at least that many people as far as when it came to them suffering a loss as well.
It's incredible because when I tried to go back to work, I had to go over to Hong Kong and do, for 3 weeks, and I came back, tried to go back to work, and I couldn't. And I had to take a family leave because I didn't know what else to do. And some people don't work for companies, they don't have family leave. They're not going to get
Right.
paid. They have to go to work and they have to get paid. They don't have a choice. Or even for those of us that work for companies and are fortunate enough to have family leave, it can feel like there's stigma attached to that, right? Like, oh, I'm weak
Right.
if I have to take this time from my job, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that I just want to commend you. I think it's amazing, and the company that
Thank you.
that you could influence that kind of change, because I think I think it's tragic in our country that we do not honor, I'm going to cry, that we don't honor death
Yeah.
and grief in that way when we lose someone, and how we're supposed to go to work and function. It's sort of that old, adage of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and how
Right.
debilitating grief actually is. All right.
Yes.
I'm going to bring us to, I don't want to give away everything in your book because it is just for our listeners. It's such a beautiful read. It's written in that first person point of view where that just makes it very immediate. Like it's almost, I felt like you were holding my hand through your story. It was just so beautiful. So thank you for the gift that you have given to the world with your story, and so generous in so much of what you share. But the cover of your book with the sunflowers, I just want to tell our listeners, I was telling Janice that it's my symbol for my brother too. The sunflowers are very important. And so I'd love for you, do you have your book handy right in front of you to read?
I do. I do.
Can you read the excerpt? I just want you to read about the meaning of the sunflower, because the sunflower held deep meaning for you too. But when I read it, I bawled my eyes out.
Aw.
But I think it's a beautiful way to sort of bring this interview full circle of the symbolism of the sunflower in your own grief journey.
Yes. Thank you. Okay. Let me know. Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm just going to listen.
Okay. So, why do I have such a love of sunflowers? Initially, it was a surface level attraction. I was drawn to their uniqueness, their vibrant colors, and the way they seemed to exude confidence. My intrigue in them soon blossomed, and I became more familiar with their behaviors. Sunflowers follow the sun. They look for the light and make it their focus. In doing so, they turn away from the darkness. It is one of the things I deeply admire about them. For much of my life, I aimed to emulate the sunflower's above ground orientation to what I surmised was all things positive. Over the years, I deepened my knowledge and understanding of my favorite flower and came to a personal revelation. Sunflowers spend a lot of time in darkness. They grow in nutrient-rich soil throughout the night, even while blooming. By facing the darkness, they can reach their full brilliance.
It's so gorgeous. I love it so much.
Thank you.
So in wrapping up, you've listened to my episodes. You know what I'm going to ask you.
Yes.
What does self-love look like for you now?
I love that question. And for me, I'll tell you, it feels like connection. And it looks like creating space for me. That can be anything from spending time in the outdoors, like soaking up the sights and sounds around me. It can be feeling my feelings, even those that I once avoided, like fear, anger, sadness, and replacing that judgment I had for myself with that genuine compassion instead of the what's wrong with me. It's letting my emotions and feelings flow through me. And it's really creating space for me is tuning in to what I need in the moment. And I've found that by doing that, I'm unveiling more and more of my true self.
That's so beautiful. I'm deep into yoga, and I went to a yoga retreat this weekend. And I think that what I love so much about it is trying to quiet our incredibly busy mind that can sink us into the body so we even know where we're holding emotion, where we're holding stress, and giving that love to those spaces that need our breath and need our love. And so I think that, one of the most profound pieces for me around that story was the pain, and you literally found an outlet to release, which is just incredible. Yeah. I would like you to tell our listeners where they can find you.
Yes, the best way to find me is on Instagram at Inner Trailblazer. And my book that you mentioned, Opening Up to Grief, is available on Amazon.
And we will have links to all of
great.
that too in our show notes. As we say goodbye, is there anything else you would like to say to our listeners? Maybe something I didn't ask you that you feel is really important for them to hear, or something I may have forgotten?
I really want your listeners to know, if they have experienced a loss, my message is really for them. And that is that your loss is real and your feelings matter.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners. I love you guys. I hope that there are some nuggets of hope that you can take with you from this incredible conversation with my guest today, Janice. And thank you so much for showing up and for sharing your story with the world.
Thank you.
And that's all for today. Bye for now. We'll see you guys here next week. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Leap, please subscribe, share it with others, or leave a rating and review so others can benefit from this content. Be sure to check out the show notes for resources related to this episode. And to catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at Susan.Casey. If you have a transformational story to share on grief